Okay, thank you all for coming for this webinar organized by African Space Leadership Institute. My name is Etimofyong. I'm co-founder and CEO of the ASLI. I'll just share briefly about ASLI as we go into the webinar. Just to know that we are currently based in Pretoria, South Africa. The title of the presentation, as you are aware, is Space Diplomacy, What You Need to Know. Basically, we are not doing an in-depth lecture about space diplomacy. Of course, we'll do an introduction to different concepts, but it's also to just highlight what are the things one needs to know if you actually want to function properly in this field. Space diplomacy is actually a field that is emerging or has emerged. It's kind of a standalone field now. So we are very conversant with space law. Space policy is now a field standing on its own. So some people combine it with space law. And then, of course, there's space governance. Now, the talk now is about space diplomacy. So since it's we are not many, so you're welcome to, at any point in time, you can just, you can jump in more or less, and if you have any thoughts, any comments. Unfortunately, right now, I don't know, for my system, I can't control my chat box. So I may not be able to access the chat box if you write anything there until I finish the presentation. So you can actually speak so that, or if you want to wait to the end of the presentation. So just a brief about how the ASLI started. A few years ago, we just, a couple of us who were involved in developing the African space policy and strategy. We saw the gap in terms of knowledge about space policy, space law, space strategy in Africa. And so we did something like a survey about how those kind of things are done abroad, how people advise organizations or governments about space so that they can make informed decisions. And then we were able to write this paper, which is available online. It was titled Towards a Space Policy Institute for Africa. That was as far back as 2018. So since then, we've been nursing this idea about establishing a think tank which could fill that gap for Africa. And then last year, we eventually launched the think tank on 4th of October, 2022. For those of us who are conversant with space, 4th of October is very important in the space domain. It was the 4th October 1957 was when the very first satellite was launched into space, the Sputnik. So since then, it's been regarded that the space age started 4th of October 1957. So for us, the dawn of space, the new space era, started in Africa 4th of October 2022. So the vision is really to see an African space ecosystem that meets the developmental needs and aspirations of the African people, and that is globally responsible and relevant. If you are aware about the workings of the African Union, there's this Agenda 2063, which spells out the socio-economic framework for development for Africa. So our vision kind of aligns with that. If you pick the two documents, because our emphasis is about the ecosystem as a whole, so everybody that is and all the activities involved in the ecosystem. If you pick the two documents which we produced, which was adopted by the heads of state in 2016, everything in that space policy and that space strategy documents can be put in this diagram that you see on the right. Everything about that. So our vision is to see how this ecosystem will thrive. At the topmost part, you have the 4 priority areas of the African Union Space Program: Earth observation, communications, navigation and positioning, space science and astronomy. And then the next, the things we need to put in place in order to be able to make maximum benefits from the priority areas. So we need to develop human capital, we need to develop industry, we need to develop infrastructure, we need to foster international partnerships, which is closely connected to what we are talking about. And then what are the other activities we need to be engaged in? So space missions, develop new technologies, space operations, and of course, space applications. All these need to work within the framework of appropriate laws, policies, strategies, and governance frameworks. So ASLI tries to push on the different frontiers of this ecosystem. So we have three major objectives, and this was born out of the observations we made when we were doing that research. One of the things we observed then was that in Africa, there is a very poor decision-making process, very poor policy-making process. And because it's poor, it's not structured, it's not well-informed, the things that come after that are kind of faulty. They have little or no impact. They are not sustainable. So one of our objectives is to build Africa's capabilities and capacity in space policy, strategy, law, governance, diplomacy, and leadership. Another gap that we observed then was our programs are very weak. They are not sustainable. Many of the programs in Africa are funded from outside Africa. This has a lot of implications for the African program. That means you have little or no control over your programs, and they may have little or no impact, because those who are funding it have their own primary goals and objectives, which may not align with that from Africa. So our second objective is to ensure that our programs are properly positioned and they can make impact. Another gap we see is that Africa does not participate very well in international forums. Space is global. The decisions about space are made on a global level. And once those decisions are made, whether you are in the room or not, they are more or less binding on you. So we don't participate effectively, and even where sometimes we attend, but we don't contribute. And it could be for different reasons. Sometimes we feel that we are not capable enough. Sometimes there's just this indifference to what's going on. So one of the objectives we also want to do is to strengthen Africa's participation in international forums. And one of the things we try to do is, before going out, let's kind of talk to ourselves in-house, so that by the time we are going out, we have a common position that we are presenting outside. One of the things we do when it comes to capacity building is we do a couple of courses. We leave the engineering for the universities, this is the science research, we leave it for the universities and research institutions. We try to do other things that are not done in the universities, but which are necessary for the ecosystem. So like this year, we organized 3 courses. In April, May this year, we organized a course which we called Space Policy course. I think it was a 9-week course, extensive, and we invited, we have faculty from all over the world. And then that was in August, September this year, we had a course on space law and governance. Right now, we are doing a course on African space policy and strategy. So those are our flagship courses. We intend to repeat them again next year, but the space policy course, we've reviewed it, and it's now called Global Space Policy. It will come up March, April next year. The African Space Policy and Strategy course is targeted at young people, young Africans, because we want to start bringing them into understanding of what space policy, space governance is about. So it will come up again next year in July, and of course the space law and governance course. One of our observations is that our institutions also have weak governance mechanisms, both in the private sector, in the space agencies. So we plan to have a course which we've called Effective Governance of Space Institutions, tentatively fixed for August 2024. Talking about, if you look at that ecosystem that I showed earlier, one of the key things there is international partnership. So we need Africa to understand what is international partnership. How do you go about international partnership? You know, space cannot be separated from geopolitics. Space, in fact, space, which I will talk about a bit later, is directly connected to national security. So we need to understand, who do you want to partner with? Who is ready to partner with you? It's not everybody that's, you just wake up and say, I want to go into space cooperation with a country. There has to be some commonalities before you can partner with anybody. So we have this course in mind, which will come up tentatively to November 2024, and it's supposed to come up in Ethiopia, you know, and we chose that particularly because the African Union Commission or the African Union has its headquarters there, so that we can actually try and get to the diplomats. But it's actually open to people who are not pure diplomats too. Two other courses that we've planned there, but we've not fixed a date yet. But of course, as we usually announce all this well ahead of time. So here you see some of so the other one shows the courses, because, you know, we have two hats more or less. So as a school, we run courses, but as a think tank, we do things that think tanks typically do. So organize roundtables, interviews, public lectures, advisory, advocacy. One important one that we plan to do next year is a colloquium. We are planning to have a series of colloquium starting from next year. And the call is already out. You can check the website. And the call for next year, the focus is on capacity building, that space education, skills development, capacity building, and workforce engagement. So we are picking one element from that ecosystem and to try and go deeper into it. So you're welcome to participate in the colloquium. You can participate by writing paper, presenting. It will be very useful. So let's start the main discussion. I can't, sorry, let me just do this. I can't move, okay. I couldn't see my cursor. Let me just move it up here now. Let's see. Okay, good. So really, what is it's blocking? I need to move it further. Okay, let's see. Yeah, good. This is fine. So what is space diplomacy? There's this paper which you can get it online. It's a good discussion about what space diplomacy is about, especially for Global South. So in this paper, the author defines space diplomacy as leveraging on space science and technology to achieve foreign policy goals and strengthen national space capabilities. So it's important for us to understand the difference between space cooperation and space diplomacy. When we say space cooperation, two organizations, two companies, two countries can just come together to do a project. That's nothing else attached. We don't do the project. We get the benefits from doing those projects together. Maybe we want to do a research and then to get knowledge to find out about something, or maybe it's a business. So that's just cooperation, space cooperation. But once you're bringing in foreign policy objectives, then it's a slight tilt. Now you're talking about space diplomacy. So it's good to understand that difference. Now, Patrick is very much aware of the concept, and maybe some of us who know about science diplomacy. So there's this concept in science diplomacy, 3 dimensions of science diplomacy. There's science in diplomacy. Let me just bring it up. So there's science in diplomacy, there's diplomacy for science, and then there's science for diplomacy. We can actually map that concept into space also. So when we say space diplomacy, it actually means you're trying to use knowledge from space science and technology to inform diplomatic negotiations. One central thing that means is that whoever has more knowledge or prior knowledge will likely have the upper hand when it comes to diplomatic negotiations. So it also hints at the importance of doing research when it comes to science and technology. Earlier on, I mentioned when it comes to the issue of space governance, when it comes to space, activities in space are decided on a global level. And once those decisions are made, whether it's in form of treaties or norms or guidelines, it's kind of binding on anybody that wants to do anything in space. So it is those who are in the room, in fact, not only in the room, those who are on the table and who are contributing, those are people that get to make the decisions. And they make decisions based on their higher level of understanding. So I'm saying it because if Africa really wants to engage, we need to do the science, we need to do the engineering. That is what is going to inform whatever contributions we bring when it comes to space governance. Just focusing on space governance or space law may not help. It's good, it's important, but we need people who will also be doing the science and engineering. The other concept is borrowing from diplomacy for science. So we now have diplomacy for space. And that's when you want to get engaged in a form of space cooperation, you now use your knowledge of diplomacy or contacts to forge international space cooperation. So for example, some of us, you may have heard about this project called the SKA, the Square Kilometer Array, which is the largest science project right now. I think it's not yet fully active, but I think it will be fully operational by 2028. Many countries are involved, but in Africa, it's primarily South Africa in collaboration with about 8 other African countries. Space is very expensive and has a lot of risk involved. So sometimes you want to share this cost, you want to share this risk with other people. In order to do that, you need to have good relations with some of the people you want to work with. So you need that friendly environment, that the diplomatic environment, in order for you to achieve your purpose of when it comes to space cooperation. That's SK. The same thing with the ISS, the International Space Station. Maybe I should just give you a background. The ISS was originally a US concept. It was a US project called Space Station Freedom. But about the time the ISS was coming on board, that was when Russia disintegrated, and then former Soviet Union disintegrated. And the question was, the Russian scientists, what do we do with them? And what do we do with Russia? So the ISS, the president at that time, if I remember correctly, it was Bill Clinton, invited Russia to join the ISS, the project of building the space station. So it was now changed from Space Station Freedom to International Space Station. So there was a clear diplomatic or foreign policy objective in bringing Russia in. And of course, in also trying to ensure that the engineering knowledge that was in Russia at that time does not get proliferated. So the purpose was also to concentrate that energy in a particular project. And then finally, so just like we have science for diplomacy, you can also have space for diplomacy. And that's really, you're trying to use activities in space to improve relations between countries. One of the ones that is very glaring right now is US and India. So you may be aware that the NASA administrator, I think is still in India. He was in India this week. So trying to forge space cooperation with India for them to do a couple of things, but also to bring the countries together, closer together, of course, for some other objectives also. So once you're using space cooperation to advance your foreign policy, that's the dimension is called space for diplomacy. So this is more or less something, it's intertwined, but it's more for an academic purpose. But it's also good to also be able to identify in which realm you're operating so that you know how to operate in that realm. So what are the benefits of space diplomacy? One, you're able to build scientific and technical capabilities. So the people who are participating in that project, they build scientific and technical capabilities, right? The countries have different levels of scientific knowledge or capabilities. So I come to another country, join together, and then we like a pool, and we share knowledge, we share technology. Sometimes let me give you an example, like the International Space Station, ISS. The different countries are contributing different parts to that project. They don't all have the same capabilities. So, for example, Russia is very strong as at that time when it came to launch capability. And then Canada developed the Canada arm, the arm that is attached to the ISS. And they use the opportunity to develop their capability in space robotics. So space diplomacy is really very good. Now there's the Artemis program, and the countries that are involved in the Artemis program, they will, because you're going to be contributing, so you get to develop whatever aspect that you want to develop. The other benefit is you have access to expertise. So, because most times when it comes to space cooperation, money does not change hands. It's not that I give you money and something. No, most times people get involved in a project, a big project. So each person determines, okay, I will do this part, you do this part. When it's cooperative, then of course, definitely that knowledge will move somehow, technology will move somehow. Another thing about space diplomacy is you're able to develop technological infrastructure, the countries that are participating. So let's use the SKA again as an example. By hosting the SKA in South Africa has built up a huge, massive infrastructure. In fact, the area where the SKA is located, there's actually they call it Astronomy Geographical Advantage Act. So they've actually passed a law to ensure that any other activity in that region does not affect the activities of the SKA. So you develop that infrastructure, you develop other capabilities also by participating in space cooperative activities. So it's really very useful because sometimes in a country, maybe due to the internal politics, you may not get the necessary support to pursue some giant projects. But when you come and join with some other countries, there's most times your country will want to back you up, but some other times you're able to share resources to build up infrastructure. So sometimes also, because it's a project, you don't want, one person does not want to do every aspect of the same project. So when I focus on one part, you focus on another part, so there won't be any duplication. We save energy, we save time, we save resources. So that's another benefit of space diplomacy. And of course, as I've mentioned before, you get to advance your country's foreign interest. The other thing about space diplomacy or space cooperative work is you get to meet people also. And by that, you build relationships with them. It's like when we started, I mentioned some people's names here, and that's because we've done one thing or the other in the past, or we've met somewhere in the past. So coming together to do cooperative works, we're able to build personal relations, there's mutual respect, we build trust, which translates to peace. There's a lot of conflict in the world, but by doing things together, it promotes peace. So now let's get into some more interesting part. The main practice. What are the things you need to know if you want to practice, maybe to be called a space diplomat or to practice space diplomacy? And first, you need to know the environment. You need to know, the physical environment. So when we say space, what do we really mean? If I say space to some people, they will think I'm talking about the physical space, maybe in the room I am or something. But we know that when we say space, we are talking about outer space. That's the region above the airspace. So we need to understand the environment, the physics of the environment. What are the things that can go on in that environment? For example, it's not clearly accepted where space actually starts from. Some people want it to be 80 kilometers, some others want it to be 100 kilometers, but there's clearly an interest, a national interest, in not defining a clear-cut demarcation where space starts from. So we need to know where space starts from and what kind of things can go on in space. We need to understand that space has dual use. It can be used for civil or scientific purpose, but it can also be used for military purpose. Space technology cannot be separated from nuclear technology. If you have a rocket and you put your satellite on top and you launch it, fine, you've launched a satellite. That same rocket, remove the satellite and put a bomb on top. You have something that has to do with nuclear technology. So it's intertwined. And that's why people, just like nobody will give you nuclear technology, nobody gives you space technology too, in the literal sense. There has to be some exchange, if at all you're going to get space technology. So you need to understand how this dynamics works. The way it works in the nuclear domain, it's very similar to how it works in the space domain. We need to understand geopolitics also. The relations of countries, how it happens right now, most times is actually what you see in space. The countries that identify with US, which are called US allies or US partners, you will see that oftentimes they work with US on US space programs. They may not, or they may, depending on what's their strategic interest, identify with China space programs or Russia space programs. So we cannot rule out geopolitics. You need to understand that. And when trying to get engaged in any space activity, we have to bear that in mind. Another concept in the space domain is that space is increasingly contested, congested, and competitive. And we need to understand this also. We need to know when should we cooperate and when to we compete, because you can't separate those two. So generally, we need to understand the space environment. We need to know the actors or the people that are playing in the environment. So you need to know it at the national level, like in our country. So like in Nigeria, where I'm from, I need to know who are the people involved or who are the organizations involved in space. The National Space Agency, the National Space Council, in the legislature, in the judiciary, who are the people in the industry, who are the actors. In South Africa, you need to read about the South African National Space Agency, South African Council for Space Affairs. In the Ministry of the Department of Science and Innovation, there is a department responsible for space there. You need to know about them. And then other institutions too that have anything to do with space. So you need to know, for the country that you're interested in also, you need to know who are the actors, who are the institutions involved. So like in the US, you have NASA, you have the Federal Aviation Administration, you have NOAA, that's the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. And of course, you have the National Space Council, which sits under the office of the US Vice President. The same thing in the UK. So you need to know, depending on which countries are of interest to you. At the regional level also, for Africa, who are the people that make decisions, the African Union Commission, and the African Space Agency, which will soon be coming into operations soon, at the EU, and then very importantly at the international level too, because that's where a lot more activities or decisions are made. COOPUS, Committee on Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. You need to know about COOPUS. What is the function of COOPUS? How do they function? COOPUS meets 3 times. Each of those meetings are for specific purposes. How do you get engaged in those meetings? And then the Secretariat, the United Nations Office for Outer Space Affairs. You need to know about them. And even within the UN system, there's what they call UN Space. All the organizations that use space for anything within the UN, they are grouped together under UN Space. They also have their meetings from time to time. You need to understand how that works. Several instances, decisions have to get to the UN General Assembly, and they meet September, most times every year. Sometimes it could be December. You need to understand how the decision-making process until it gets to the UN General Assembly. The UN also has some specialized organizations, which, even though they focus on a different aspect, but it's connected to space. So like the ITU, the International Telecommunications Union, which determines frequency spectrum sharing or orbital allocation. We need to understand how the ITU works. It's a technical body, but there's politics and geopolitics that also plays in the ITU. In fact, people plan, the ITU has this meeting they call WLC, which meets every 4 years. People plan years ahead for that meeting because decisions are made there which are binding, treaty-like. Another one is ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Organization, because of the connection between airspace and outer space. So you also need to understand all that. So generally, know the actors, know the institutions. In fact, sometimes you need to know them in person so that you can have a fruitful engagement. You need to know the regulatory regimes also. So at the national level, like in Nigeria, there's the Nigerian Space Policy and Programs. There is the Act that established the Nigerian Space Agency. We need to understand all that. You have of course, the Defense Space Strategy also in Nigeria. Similarly, the regulatory regimes in other countries also. You need to understand what goes on there. What are the priorities of those countries? At the regional level, like in Africa, we have the African Space Policy and Strategy. The EU has its own space policy. They also have a space strategy for defense and security. And of course, very importantly, the outer space treaties. Every regulation, every policy, every law at the national or regional level must align with the outer space treaties, 5 of them. So we need to understand the outer space treaties because we can't go against the outer space treaties and the principles. These days, a lot of new technologies are emerging. A lot of new actors are coming up in space, both in the industry and military activities. And people have been talking about, let's reopen the outer space treaties, let's renegotiate, and so that we can cater for these new activities. But it appears that's not settling down well with a lot of people. So this, instead of that, non-treaty governance frameworks are being developed, a lot of norms, a lot of guidelines, a lot of principles are being developed. So not only should we know about them, but we need to be engaged in the making of those norms, principles, and guidelines. Because like those who have a background in law, customary law can actually become binding depending on how things evolve. So know the regulatory regimes. It's not only for lawyers, it's for anybody who is interested in space diplomacy or is interested in space. You also need to be aware, at least to some extent, about emerging issues, trends, technologies. For example, there's a lot of talk about going back to the moon now. You may be aware of different countries, their projects, what they are doing. India with Chandrayaan, China, everybody trying to get to the South Pole of the moon or the far side of the moon. And then, of course, from the moon, the plans to go to Mars. You need to know what's going on, what technologies are being developed, what are the implications of this. In-orbit activities, before those early years, when you launch a satellite, that's the end. It just stays there until it finishes its lifetime, and then some people abandon it there or you move it away from whatever it is. But now, new technologies are being developed. There's RPO, rendezvous and proximity operations. So you can, if you have your satellite, you can actually another satellite or robot can come near it. You can refuel a satellite. Once your fuel finishes, that's the end of the satellite. But now you can refuel it. You can move a satellite from where it is, a current slot, you can drag it to another location. And that, of course, has national security implications, because if country A drags the satellite of country B, especially if it's a communication satellite or a military satellite, to another location, that can spur up conflict. So we need to understand what issues are coming up in space. Space resource mining, people are talking about going to space to mine, especially what they call rare earth metals, some metals that are not common on Earth. And sometimes mine resources in space with the intent of using it in space, or sometimes bringing it back to the Earth. What are the implications of these new technologies? What are the implications of these new activities? It's important to look at the different ramifications. Also, before, when you want to launch a satellite, you launch a big, giant satellite into space. But now you can launch a number of satellites together at once into space. You call them mega constellations. Sometimes as many as 100 can be launched at once, especially if they are very, very small satellites. This also has implications too, because in space, like I mentioned earlier, there's this increasing congestion in space. So you need to understand that also. A lot more companies are getting involved in space. I mean, even apart from the technological aspect, even the business aspect. So you see banks getting involved in space activities like Morgan Stanley. We see consulting firms like PwC getting involved in space. So it's a lot of interest, even media organizations too, getting involved in space also, CNBC, sometimes CNN too. So these are things that we need to be conversant with, and of course, military activities. And then other technologies maybe relating to IT, like artificial intelligence, quantum communications, quantum computing, blockchain, all those things that we use here, they all have their ramifications or applications in space. You need to be aware of these things. Also, very importantly, is that you need to know the different interests of the different people you're engaging with or you intend to engage with. So what, even in your country, starting from who are the stakeholders in your country? What are their interests? Like in the government, the president, the ministers, they all have their own interests. Some people in government have investment in some private companies. So when they are making laws or policies, in their mind, they are thinking of how it will affect their investment. So you need to, these things, they don't happen in a vacuum. Know who the stakeholders are, try and identify what their interest is. Sometimes you need to get close to them. Sometimes you need to trace back their history to know where they are coming from so that you know what their possible interest may be. The same thing also for your country of interest, you need to know what are their own interests, what are their priorities. The priorities of like Nigeria may not be the same priority with UK or US. So what are their priorities in terms of which areas they want to focus on, which programs they want to engage with, who are the people they want to partner with? So when I teach space policy, I usually show that there are 3 legs to space policy. So there's a space policy document. People focus on that, but they lose out on 2 other aspects, which is very important. There's the issue of funding or budgeting. So where a country puts money gives an idea of the priority of that country and what the policy of that country is. So if you're putting a lot of money in military space activities, we have an idea of what your policy direction is. The 3rd leg has to do with your decisions, the decision you make. A very recent one is the issue of which moon, there are more or less 2 groups of countries that are engaged in moon exploration. There's the US with the Artemis program, and then there's China, Russia with its own program, ILRS, the International Lunar Research Station, or International Lunar Station Research Program, something like that. South Africa, which you will think because it's involved in some form of the Artemis program, because they track the Artemis missions from some stations in South Africa. But South Africa signed up with the China-Russia program. So you don't need anybody to tell you that, oh, this is the policy direction of South Africa. This is who they've chosen to partner with. It does not mean that they are your enemies. It's just that strategically, you know how you make your own decisions. So when you know the different interests, you now try to find a meeting point, because you have your own interest. You're not at enmity with anybody. You just want to meet your own interests. That's all. So find a meeting point of these diverse interests so that your own interests will be met, or your objectives will be met also. That's how it works. It's quite an interesting system. The other thing you also need to know are the different tools. So this book, I actually have a copy here. It's a very good book. I really recommend it for to you guys. Protocol, The Power of Diplomacy. It's a comprehensive book, very, very comprehensive, how to make diplomacy work for you. You need to understand communication, writing, very important, learning how to write. The fact that we speak English does not mean that we can write English properly, the way for actions to be taken. And then the other thing you need to understand is that the way the US write is slightly different from the way the Europeans write. So for example, when the US write, the first paragraph, everything they want to say is in the first paragraph. The action, everything is in the first paragraph. And then they now try to expand that first paragraph below. Unlike the EU believes in developing your points from up, coming down, and then you now make your final point at the bottom. So it's slightly different. We need to understand this. So we need to know how to write note verbals, how to write emails, how to write emails, how to not right, then how to speak also, whether it's one-to-one or you're in a meeting, how do you approach people, how do you speak with them? We need to have communication skills. Body language is very important. Sometimes people don't talk, but from their body language what their intent is. The same thing at the national level too. Countries may not talk, but they have a body language. They have a body language. Like a very recent one, when the coup happened in Niger, there was a lot of pressure from Nigeria to, take action, use force, use maybe through ECOWAS and all those things. But you see, Nigeria was like, okay, that's fine. They called for meetings, they did this, they did that. But you will see that nothing actually happened in Niger. So that body language actually showed a reluctance from ECOWAS countries in using force in Niger. So body language is something we need to understand also. Sometimes if there is a meeting, a global meeting, and a country does not go for that meeting, you can try and understand why that country did not go for that meeting. It may be trying to send a message. Or if a country does a courtesy call to a country, it may be sending a message. For example, if Nigeria does an official visit to Taiwan, it's sending a message not only to Taiwan, but it's sending a message to China. It's sending a message to the US. It's sending a message globally. All these are things we shouldn't take for granted. Very interesting. Then another thing we need to know: relationship skills. How do you how do you build relationship on a personal level and of course country level? One of the things I do very strongly, especially when I want to meet people, if I try to meet people maybe through a connect, if it does not work, I go to LinkedIn and try and connect with the person on LinkedIn. If the person connects with me on LinkedIn, lovely, I send a message. So even social media too is now a tool for diplomacy. How do you network? Of course, how do you presentation skills is very important. Presentation skills very important. Negotiation skills. These are things you can learn. There are courses that teach you these things. There are free courses on Coursera, on EDX. You can actually learn these things. But of course, more importantly, learning by experience will have more impact. Sometimes you may need to learn language. It's useful. So language breaks barriers, whether it's within your country or outside. It endears you to a person. Even if you don't know the language, the fact that you are attempting to speak the language or something as simple as just the greeting, it endears people to you. So understand language, understand culture and norms. In some parts of the world, you don't use using your right hand, it's fine. Some countries don't mind using your left hand for anything. But in some countries, if you're using your left hand, it's a sign of disrespect, or some people even see it as a bad omen. And then, of course, etiquette also. So dressing, eating, speaking, all those things. If you're speaking with somebody, the etiquette is you allow the person to finish speaking before you respond. or if you have to respond, you have to respond respectfully. So these are things we need to understand. Small mistakes can actually mess up the whole effort that one is trying to put in, especially if it's an effort you have been putting in for several years. So those are some of the things that we need to know. There are a couple of others which we can discuss, and of course we can engage in. I think this should be my last slide. So some recommendations as individuals, for organizations. We need to get actively engaged on issues relating to science, relating to space. We need to develop mechanisms for that, even in our institutions. We need to try and forge bilateral, especially science cooperation, because space comes under science, right? So I really encourage countries to try and form bilateral, active, functional cooperation. It's not just about signing an agreement. Many times we sign agreements with another country and nothing comes out of it. So in forging bilateral cooperation, make sure that there's a program attached, there are projects attached, there are timelines attached. We need to build capacity at the science and engineering component, but also the law, governance, and diplomatic component also. Build capacity as an individual, build capacity within your organization, build capacity in your country. I also encourage that, especially at the ministry or the departments, there should be a department or a unit that will be engaged in diplomacy. You see it a lot in NASA, in different organizations. You see that happening. Even in Nigeria's Ministry of Science and Tech, there's actually an office responsible for policy and diplomacy. They may not be as functional as you expect, but it's there. Embassies also usually have attaches. So if your embassy does not have attache, I think it's important to have that. Attaches, science attache, of course they have military attache, but they also have science attache, and its role basically is to scout around to know what are the opportunities that are available. In some cases, there are space attaches, people who are specifically responsible for space. That's their portfolio. Some countries have it, like I know the US, the French embassy in US, they have somebody responsible for space. JAXA has somebody responsible for space in the US. So depending on the level of engagement, that will determine whether you actually want somebody for space or for science, but it's important to have people responsible for these activities. It's also good and necessary to have healthy governmental relationships. The ministry should be able to talk to each other. The department should be able to talk to each other. I can't imagine that, let me use Nigeria. The Nigerian Space Agency is getting involved in a space activity with another country, and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is not aware. It's not healthy. Or if I use South Africa, the South African National Space Agency is engaging in an activity, and DECO is the Department for International Relations and Cooperation of South Africa. If they are not aware, it's not healthy. So we need healthy relationships amongst government departments and institutions. In fact, like in the US, they have what they call the all of government approach. So they try to carry all government entities along in different activities or engagement. And that's why the US has what they call the National Space Council, which oversees kind of space activities for the entire country. And then finally, we need to develop frameworks, policy frameworks, strategy frameworks for leveraging on space diplomacy. Recently, some weeks ago, the US Department of Space released this document, which you can also download and read, a strategy framework for space diplomacy. And that shows you or hints that the US wants to put some more effort, a lot more effort in leveraging on space for diplomacy, which also hints on the role or the increasing role of NASA when it comes to diplomacy. And that's why you see Nelson, the administrator, traveling to different countries. He meets a lot of presidents. many presidents that visit US, you will see that they want to visit NASA, right? The French president, when he was in the US, visited NASA. So because they want to engage and they want to leverage on space diplomacy. So I think that's just a few things I just wanted to share. So more or less, you see that it's an interesting field. It's an interesting time we are in, and we see a lot of opportunities that in it for us and what we need to do as individuals or for our countries or our organizations. So thanks once again, and I'm happy for us to discuss any questions or any.
You have stopped screen share.
So yeah, let's discuss, please. Or if you have any questions, let me know.
Good morning, good afternoon.
Good morning, good afternoon too.
My name is Paul Oladune from Space Tourism Society Africa. I was at the last meeting you had, and it was mind-blowing. And from there, I said I should not miss any of your meetings, because I remember that the professor who spoke from either Kenya, there's this person from Angola. So I was from the beginning to the end. It was like I was jotting everything they were saying, because everything looks like I've never had this thing before. And when I now listen to your, should I call it a lecture now? It was like, wow, 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 wow. And yeah, seriously, it was like, I was mind blowing. I was meant to go somewhere. I said, I thought yesterday was this program. So I stay awake. It was like I was busy. I didn't do anything. Because most time when you want to, when you're attending a Zoom meeting, it will tell you the exact time in your country. So until later, I got another information that it's going to be today. And let me say, it's a mind blowing, and these are the things that I've never heard in a long while. That was like a refresher course. And please, next time when we are doing this kind of a thing, I would love to be involved. I would love my society to be involved, because I work with Space Tourism Society in the US, and we have access to all these space tourism companies, and every year we have this space tourism conference. So, and I believe that this is one of the ways in which Africa can actually benefit. I also have access to ISESCO, and ISESCO is an education aspect of Organization of Islamic Cooperation, and which I believe Nigeria is actively part of it. So I'm looking for a collaboration, because they have their funding. The money is not their problem. And one of those things that you made mention of is funding, and when we are talking about localizing your fund, like what you said in your speech, it's more like even though we are part of OIC, and it's true, the headquarters of OIC is the education aspect, that is successful, is based in Morocco, which is in Africa. So which is an opportunity for us to actually, no matter the amount where the funding is coming from, as long as Nigeria is still part of OIC, at least, and the headquarters is in Morocco, we can actually get something from them. So it's nice. I really enjoy this thing. And like I said, I would love to be part of the next one, or anytime you're having a program. Kudos. Well done, sir.
Thanks very much, Mr. Paul. And yeah, I've heard of Space Tourism Society Africa before, but I've not really come close. So it's nice to kind of get close. And I think it would be nice to meet with you. There's a lot of potential when it comes to space tourism. So I would like to discuss with you.
Please, where is your office?
Well, it's we are based in South Africa, but we do a lot of things on virtually. So we can just arrange to meet maybe virtually, unless you want to come to South Africa. So we can meet and discuss, yeah. So any question, any thoughts? Dr. Ezekiel, you are kind of an expert in this area, so
yeah, it's I think it's it's an interesting presentation, honestly, and you touched on a number of things that are quite pertinent. And like I said, because of my involvement in science diplomacy, I think I'm quite conversant with some of the things you mentioned. And again, with some new dimensions that are coming into it. Mine will be in two ways, maybe question and some comments. Some of them you've already commented on. Sorry, let me give this boy something to get busy because he might not let me talk.
It's okay.
Sorry about that. So
No problem at all. Yeah.
I think you touched on that, the sensitivity of space. I think it's one of the top security areas actually, that cooperation internationally, it's quite a delicate decision to make. You look at the recent EU Horizon funding. When I looked at the funding allocated to space cooperation, it's less than 2%, maybe around 1% thereabout. So they are quite selective of which countries they get involved in space issues. And I like very much the way you try to liken it to the idea of nuclear diplomacy, if I should put it that way, because it's another sensitive issue. But while I'm trying to still dwell on this, I have one or two questions. The first one would be, the first one would be, maybe from your work, as far as Africa is concerned, looking at the capacity of the different countries, which of these countries probably you have seen that, apart from South Africa, of course, obviously they are in the lead in a way, that has that potential to leapfrog in terms of developing their space capability? That is one. Then number two, for Nigeria, I try to understand what their priority in space is. They mentioned quite a number of things, then I can't pin one thing that I can say this is what Nigeria is really doing with space, okay? They mentioned they want to use it for agriculture, they want to use it for security, they want all manner of stuff. But I can still assure you that when you try to look for some kind of geospatial data to inform certain things you want to do with respect to agriculture, or you end up going back to Australia or somewhere in the US to get some of this data to inform how you will do your crop rotation or plantation in Nigeria. So I really don't know the priority that Nigeria is looking at in terms of space. So maybe you have an idea about that. Sorry, I'm just going to put all the questions. I might leave the other ones for us to talk about, so I'll pick other people to talk. Yeah. The other question I would have is in diplomacy, let me say in science diplomacy in general, there's something about soft power, like trying to use that which you have to enter into some of this negotiation, you know, to influence other countries to do stuff. And in a sense, I would say that the soft power that South Africa had that probably brought the SKA project, it's maybe the geographical location of where it is. I think that in a sense contributed to why it was chosen beyond their historic capabilities in astronomy. So if I ask directly now, what kind of soft powers do you see in some of these countries around the continent? Are there other kind of soft powers, or what you see that they can leverage on to actually help them develop space for you? That they can actually leverage on to develop space. Maybe the last one, so I don't have too many. There are too many on my head, but let me just put this last one. This one has to do with geopolitical tension and how it affects space diplomacy. At least we are beginning to see that, you know, happening in recent times. If you move all the way from how it happened between Russia, Ukraine, now we're talking about the coups going on in Nigeria, that aircraft have to be diverted, and all of those kind of logistics. To what extent can you say space diplomacy can actually guarantee the kind of diplomacy, like kind of cooperation, the kind of international cooperation we're actually looking for? And one thing you mentioned, which is also another fact that we battle with in science diplomacy, is how you are able to balance the interaction between competition and cooperation. It's a very, I know you said you touched on that a bit, but maybe you should look at that now if you have anything to say about that within the context of geopolitical tension, right? So maybe you can help us, maybe from your own experience, share some light on this. Sorry, I'm saying too many things, but I just want to pour out a few things.
No, it's fine. So
Thank you.
I will open it for all of us. We can share our thoughts on it. But I'll just say from my own thoughts, and then we can discuss. So let me start with the EU Horizon, which is a very, I've actually not gone through that document, but it's something I've been looking forward to doing. So I was not even aware that space was even contained there. I just felt that it should be something that one can benefit from there. So now that you mentioned that the funding for space is less than 2%, but just to mention that EU has other mechanisms for funding space, which is not, I don't think is captured in that EU Horizon. So what the EU decides to do is to directly implement space programs or space projects in Africa and developing countries, depending on where they are. So, for example, when it comes to Earth observation, there's a project called the GMES and Africa project, which is I don't know how much they released this time for phase 2, but for phase 1, I think it was about 33 million euro. I don't know how much it was released for phase 2. There's another project currently on CLIMSA, that's Climate Services for Africa. I don't know the price for that, but there's one coming up again. I think it's called IRIS Squared. It has to do with connectivity and communication. That one is 100 million euro. I think they're going to give 40 first, and then 60 comes something like that. So I think the EU decided to fund space programs from outside the EU Horizon instrument. Even though I think there should be some things that can come up in that through that EU Horizon instrument too. In terms of countries that can leapfrog, so actually I'm usually very careful about that terminology, leapfrog. It's a bit, I don't know how to say, it's not very realistic in the sense that if you say you're leapfrogging, it's like we as, okay, maybe because of science background, it's like you're jumping a process and you want to get to another stage. You may not be, it may not be sustainable in the long run. If you jump a child that wants to start running when he can't, or he has not crawled, he has not walked, people that have gone ahead, they got there by learning through failures. So leapfrogging is something I'm usually careful about and I try to avoid. But just to say that there are capabilities in Africa that we can build on, that we can leverage on. So these capabilities are available in Nigeria, they're available in Rwanda, they are there in Kenya, they are there in Egypt. It's in Egypt, it's in Algeria. I think those are the countries that I'll really put. So maybe we try to be careful now so that I don't offend anybody. But if you have the first generation, so let's say Nigeria, South Africa, Egypt, those people who got into space affairs kind of a bit early, so you can call that the first generation, that it's fine. But there's this next generation that is coming up strongly, Rwanda, Kenya, Angola. Well, I shouldn't miss Angola. And they are coming up very strongly, which have capabilities already, and they are building capabilities. So those, if they continue at what they are doing, they will make a lot of progress. So rather than leapfrog, maybe my understanding of leapfrog may be different from the way it's put out there, but I think it's just good to build on the capabilities we have, and then maybe just try and accelerate the process. Maybe that will help us more. On the issue of Nigeria's priorities, well, in actual sense, there's no clear-cut. Nigeria is not, the priorities of the country are not clear-cut right now, which is not helpful. It's important for the priorities of the country to be clear. It helps the stakeholders inside to know what to focus on, and to know where to expect funding. But when the priorities are not clear, then it's problematic. It's also problematic for your partners. They don't know what your interest is, and so they don't know how to engage with you. So it's really advisable to get the priorities and programs clear. But, like I mentioned, the different legs of space diplomacy, sometimes you look at what a country is doing and we say, okay, possibly this may be their interest or priority. So in October, Nigeria organized a conference, they call it Africa Space Economy Conference and Exhibition. So we are watching to see, well, is that the way Nigeria wants to go? So let's see what if they follow in that, then we now know that, okay, there are interests or priorities about space economy and things associated with that ecosystem. Yeah, so in terms of soft power, yes, a very important concept about soft power. So what soft power do we have? And I was racking my brain, really, what soft power do we have? And the one that came to mind, really, is that we have diaspora. Africa has a very strong diaspora. And I think we can leverage on that diaspora for our own good. Even sometimes when some countries want to take decisions against Africa or an African country, the people in diaspora kind of rise up, and then because of that decision is rescinded. So I think one strong weapon, or one soft power, if I may use that word, is the diaspora. And it's so important because even in the African Union, so the African Union has what they call the geopolitical structures. So there's North Africa, there's East Africa, there's West Africa, there's Central Africa, there's Southern Africa. The sixth geopolitical zone, according to the African Union, is the diaspora. So they see that as a very a leverage, a strong weapon. Now, how you engage with the diaspora is another thing. See how India engages with the diaspora. See how China engages with the diaspora. If you're not strategic, if you don't leverage on it, it's not just about diaspora sending money back to the country. You need to find a way to engage to get better benefits from diaspora. Another thing which you mentioned has to do with geopolitical tension, which, like you rightly said, affects what happens in space. And so, like I also mentioned, some people also try to kind of find let's cooperate in space in order to forge peace. So imagine if India and Pakistan decide to come in to do a space project together. Naturally, the tensions on the ground will reduce, so to say. But a very clear example is the International Space Station. US and Russia are not in very good terms. In fact, it's at a very low ebb right now. But when it comes to ISS, they align, they talk to each other, and they try to align with that. So you see that space can actually be a tool for easing out these conflicts and tensions. It just depends on how we use it, how we leverage on it. I was trying to look for another example. And then just finally, before I also give the floor down, it's how do you balance competition and cooperation? Very important question, and I think it really requires a lot of expertise to balance out this issue of competition and cooperation. So let's look at US-India. So US is making a lot of approaches to India for cooperation, but that does not mean that there are no points of competition. I mean, in fact, you cooperate to compete, or how do they say it? You look for a way to do some things together, but you're also looking at how to get an edge or how to get some benefits. So somehow you just have to find a way to do the two together. It's I think you guys that are experts, who are the real diplomats, will we will find a way to do that. And I think one of the platforms are the international organizations. So, like, let me use, since you mentioned nuclear, the IAEA or the MTCL, the Missile Technology Control Regime, all these kind of things. You bring countries together in the name of cooperation, but of course, you know that you're competing with these guys. So you try to use laws, norms, you try to bring policies to disadvantage some other people to get some advantage. But of course, because it's negotiation and everything, at some point everybody comes to a consensus, you know. So it's almost like a win-win. But of course, so it's there. Somehow it's always there. But those are my thoughts. But I don't know if anybody has anything to say.
Thank you very much. I think they kind of address most of the things, and like the point you made about leveraging on the diaspora, that is basically what I'm doing now, respect to my policy research work I'm doing at the moment, just to see how to leverage on the diaspora for SDI development. Again, looking at their relationship with the embassy, especially. And on the concept of the science center chief, science advisors, or science envoys. Because there was a paper I worked on, I discovered that I was finding it difficult to find science attaches for the Nigerian embassies, you know, responsible for certain scientific affairs. I was like, okay, this might not be good enough. And in terms of the leapfrog, what I was actually referring to, yeah, I understand it's not so easy to fly without preparation, and one could crash. But what I'm trying to bring, what made me talk about leapfrog is looking at the concept of AI and the way technology has advanced. What took countries 20 years then to achieve? Because of leverage on technology and expertise, especially of the diasporas. That could take you 5 years, that could take you, even the way we work as scientists. I remember the way we used to handle data. It could take you 3-5 days or 1 week trying to process certain kind of data. But with AI, we've been able to leverage on that to process in a matter of 30 minutes or less. So what I'm trying to say by using that word leapfrogging is looking at all the technologies that are available, the expertise, the networks, you know, the way US struggled to develop their space, we shouldn't struggle like that because of the advantages we now have. I think that's what I was just trying. But again, we can continue some of this conversation so we can have other people contribute or say what they want. Thanks. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks. And I mean, just to build on what you've said, so those are the, so it's just to identify which countries have, especially like ICT, those technologies, which countries are strong in AI or are building AI capabilities. Rwanda is doing fantastic when it comes to AI. I know Nigeria is beginning to take AI more seriously. So those countries are there. And then which countries also have the networks also, like you mentioned. So those are the countries that we can look forward at talking about them leapfrogging. And then let me also quickly touch on your work about the science attaches. So one of the challenges, especially for Nigeria, because I've tried to engage them, is the issue of, they talk about the issue of funding. So if you have a science attache, the Ministry of Science, FMST, feels that it should be a staff of FMST that should be the science attache. So if a staff of FMST is sent to an embassy, right, as a science attache, the Foreign Affairs Ministry says, okay, since you sent the person there, you should fund that position or that office. And then FMST says, no, we are trying to help you in your role. So that's dodging, that back and forth is one of the reasons why we don't have science attaches in different embassies or missions. I don't know, it could be the same challenge in other countries also. So like I mentioned in the presentation, we need healthy relations, healthy cooperation between departments, between units, between ministries. so that we can move forward in getting the advantages. Because the science attaches, they do a lot of work. When I do this presentation, I forgot, I didn't put it on this slide. I usually talk about the role of an embassy. The role of an embassy is very important to understand the role of an embassy. It's not just about going there to get visa. Embassies play many important roles, and it's good we understand that and leverage on that too. Yeah, thank you. Any more thoughts or comments or questions? Okay.
I think while they are trying to think around that, like what you mentioned about this interagency cooperation, in terms of what I've also found is that, the National Innovation Council, National Research and Innovation Council of Nigeria, there is something fundamentally wrong about the constitution of the board. So that's the board, the governing, I think the governing board. I think the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is even missing in that document. So it's one of the documents I'm analyzing, and I am seeing how fragmented or how disconnected some of the critical stakeholders who should be involved in STI matters are not even, included in that council. So I think for me, it's a huge weakness that I am also trying to, though the national policy on science and tech has the Ministry of Affairs as one of the stakeholders. And of course, that thing you mentioned about the staff of the Ministry of Science and Tech being seconded or sent to the embassies as science attaches, for me, that should be the fundamental. That is what it should be. In terms of how it is funded, how it should not be funded, that should be a national coordination issue. It shouldn't be an agency issue, right? So, but again, we are bringing up a lot of things that are of interest to me, but let me try to, like you said, we always meet to talk about some of these things too. Yeah, thank you very much for the presentation.
Yeah, thanks. I think it's very important for us to really, this concept of science diplomacy, we need to entrench it into our national innovation system. It's so important. You just can't do without it now because of how we are connected globally. South Africa is very, very strong on science diplomacy. In their Department of DSI, Department of Science and Innovation, you have people who are responsible. In fact, there's somebody responsible for bilateral relations within Africa. There's another person responsible for bilateral relations outside Africa. There are people responsible for different instruments. There are different agreements. There's somebody who is overseeing that to ensure that they are functional. These are people I know some of them. So it works very strongly in South Africa. In December, every December, first week of December, they have what they call Science Forum. It's a global event, even though it's South Africa. But people come from, at least I know somebody that is going from University of Sussex, going for that program in South Africa. So they are very strong because they understand the importance of this, and that's why they're able to get a lot of benefits, SKA, Artemis program, and they can also use that as soft power. They can also use it to get by some things that if Nigeria does, or if Ghana does, it will not be taken lightly by the global community. But South Africa can do some things, and people don't worry. People don't. You can't do them anything. Okay, like the Israel-Hamas challenge now. South Africa has taken its own position, and you can't really go against them. You can't pull them down for what they are doing. So we just really need to entrench this understanding about science diplomacy at the national level. And then maybe we should also see how we can, for you guys that are involved in it, how to step it up at the African Union Commission too. It's really, really very important. And I think we should. Okay, I don't know if is anybody any more comments or questions? Otherwise, we can adjourn. So like for ASLI, what we intend to do is still to do some more education when it comes to space diplomacy. So, like I mentioned during the course, so we plan to do a course. We titled it "Maximizing International Space Cooperation." It's either going to be physical in Ethiopia, and this is where the diplomats are, or most of the diplomats are, or we'll make it hybrid so that a lot more people will participate. But that's one step we want to do in taking this further. And if there are any ideas, any initiatives, please, we can always connect and see how we can build together. You know, the whole idea now is Africa, we need to build together, not try to do things in silos anymore. So with that, I think we can adjourn the webinar for now. Thanks so much once again for coming, and I look forward to engaging with us at some other platforms. Thank you. Thanks so much. Thank you, everyone. And bye for now.
Bye.